Good evening and welcome to Chasing the Facts. I'm Sam Chase, your host, and this is the second in our series of candidate forums for the Chelmsford Town election, which will be held on April 1st of this year. That is the first Tuesday in April. So the first candidate forum we did was Select Board. Tonight we have folks that are running for Planning Board. So we will introduce them in sequence. At the end of the table, we have Marcie Comtois. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
You did.
We had that discussion off camera, so I practiced a little bit. And then next to Marcie, we have Joel Luna. And then next to me, we have Annita Tanini. So I'll try to set the stage a little bit here for the logistics of this particular race. And if I say something wrong, one of you jump in and please correct me. Annita is seeking her second full term on the board. You were elected 3 years ago, so you're running for re-election. So when you see her name on the ballot, it'll have the letter I next to it, signifying incumbent. And then we have Joel, who is also seeking a 3-year term. And Joel started off as an alternate and then was appointed, I guess. Am I saying this correctly? You were appointed?
As an alternate, and then I was elected the following spring.
You were elected the following spring. You think, it's only a year ago, you think I'd remember that? But, you know, now this is when I play the old card. Okay. I don't remember so well. So you are actually running now for a full 3-year term, and that would be Mike Walsh's.
Correct. I was appointed in November to a regular position. That was actually Paul McDougall's.
Okay. This is very confusing, folks.
And now I'm running for the regular position, which is Mike Walsh.
That's right, because Paul resigned prior to the completion of his term.
Correct.
And then we have a 2-year seat, and that's what Marcie is running for. So why do we have a 2-year vacancy? Joel, do you want to explain that?
Because Paul McDougall left the board in the middle of his in the middle of his elected position, so that means that the remaining time is a 2-year spot.
So we are filling out Paul's unexpired
We're filling out
term.
his unexpired
Okay,
term.
I got it.
Yeah,
All
you.
right, that's good.
Said it better than I did.
Boy, that's tough. That is a contested race. So Marcie, you're running to fill that 2-year unexpired term, and the other candidate is Nancy Arroway, who served a number of years on the planning board. I forget how many terms she had.
I think it was about 13.
13 years total.
believe so.
Okay, so Nancy is not with us this evening, but we're going to go ahead and do the candidate forum anyway. So why don't we start again with Marcie? Just introduce yourself to the audience, and then we'll just come down in sequence. Just very short bio sketch, whatever it is you want to say. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Marcie Comtois. I moved to Chelmsford about 13 years ago. I was born and raised in the city of Lowell, so I've always lived right next door to the town. I moved here with my husband, my 2 children, one who's going to graduate Chelmsford High School this year. The other one is currently a junior up at St. Michael's College in Colchester, Vermont. And where we bought our house, it's actually a duplex, and my parents moved right next door to us, and we, went with something like this so that my parents were close by. They helped with my kids when they were younger, and we could also help take care of them as they were getting older. But my reason for running is currently I am sitting as the Joel's alternate position became open, so I applied for that and was appointed in December for that. So I have spent the last 2 months sitting in on planning board meetings. But prior to that, I've been attending them for over 13 months now. And like most people who run for some of these boards in towns, something in your neighborhood gets you involved in it. And in my case, it was the project to 10 Hilder Street that got me involved in these town politics and being at the planning board meetings and learning about the rules and regulations and the zoning laws and things like that. And then seeing some of the other projects that were coming up while I was there, I was like, you know what, I think I might want to get involved in this and really, sort of help make sure the town's growing the way it should be growing, but also, projects are going to fit in neighborhoods the way they need to, and people in the neighborhood have a voice and have a say in it.
Okay, very good. Joel?
Well, my name is Joel Luna. I went to MIT. I'm an engineer. I went to MIT. I was in Air Force ROTC, so I went into the Air Force for 4 years after that. Since then, I've been performing data analysis, modeling, and simulation of military systems. We moved to Chelmsford in the late 90s, And then in the early 2000s, there was a 40B that was going up near our neighborhood. Our neighbors were very concerned. And so Ruth and I went to a hearing, and we were concerned about aspects of the process. And so we got involved because of that. And then as it turns out, related to that, we ended up identifying and radio tracking rare turtles. We certified probably most of the vernal pools in town, and just basically were concerned about different aspects of the environment because of that. And as a result of that, I was appointed to the ZBA, Zoning Board of Appeals, and so I was on that for 12 years. During the heyday of the 40Bs in Chelmsford, so we saw quite a few. And it was during that I became familiar with zoning and the technical aspects of stormwater, traffic, reading through, understanding the studies, the analyses, and so forth like that. And also environmental, because on 40Bs, we also get the wetlands bylaws. After about that time, I stepped down. I figured I was kind of done with my civic involvement. And then the River Neck Warehouse project came up, and a neighbor asked us to look at it and see if we could at least come and say something. And so I looked at the traffic. I got very concerned by it. And then Ruth and I ended up being involved basically because we felt there were a number of items that weren't being addressed. And so we wanted to make sure they were. And then out of that, I was appointed as the associate, as you mentioned, and so forth. And so now I'm running for the regular spot.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Anita?
Well, thanks for having me, Sam.
Oh, you're
Appreciate
welcome.
the invite. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Annita Tanini. I am born and raised in Chelmsford. Been here
A townie.
I'm a townie my entire life. Oh, it gets even better. Not only am I a townie, born and raised in East Chelmsford. Never moved out of East Chelmsford, not even to go to college. Never changed zoning precincts. And now I bought my cemetery plots in East Chelmsford. So I am officially a townie.
She's not going anywhere,
I'm not
folks.
going anywhere. I graduated Chelmsford High School. I went on to UMass Lowell, where I earned a bachelor's in both accounting and finance, and then ultimately went back and got my MBA. I am a financial executive. I've been in finance for the last 30 years. I am currently the vice president and controller of a clinical stage biopharmaceutical company, public biopharmaceutical company. I also sit on the finance committee. I've been on the finance committee for about 10 years. I'm also a town meeting rep. And as you mentioned, I've been on the planning board for the last 3 years. What initially got me interested in the planning board was when I was on the finance committee. Zoning articles, have to be, any changes to our zoning have to go to town meeting, so they get presented to the finance committee. And I was noticing there was a lot of zoning changes or proposals happening, and they seemed to follow development versus following what the town's master plan, or, is this consistent with the town? So we seem to be following the developers versus what works best for the town. That got me very much interested, and I started to pay attention a little bit more. And then, like Joel, the River Neck project came up, and that's when I really stuck my foot in it, I guess. That's when I really got involved.
Very good, and you've all done very well with your introduction, because you've answered the first question, so we can pass. So let's lead into it a little bit, and just springboard on something that actually all of you have said as to why you got involved in the planning board in the first place and got interested to the point where you wanted to serve. So how do you view the planning board's role overall as a regulatory board in town? What do you think the main mission of the planning board is?
Well,
so we'll start with Joel. Go ahead.
The planning board actually wears two hats, and I think that's an important thing to remember, because we have both a regulatory role, we're a special permit granting authority, as the ZBA is, but we're also a planning board. And so we do try to, see where are different needs with regards to zoning in town, and how can we go about establishing those zones in a way that will accomplish the goals and objectives of what the town are. And I think it's important to distinguish those two, because when you're performing your regulatory role, to some degree you need to put your planning board hat off and not view a project in terms of what do you want it to be, rather, but whether it's meeting the requirements that it needs to or not. On the other hand, you can learn from your regulatory experiences to then be able to think about what are ways in which we want to change zoning. And that's some of what we already have been doing, both currently Kate's Corner, and prior to that, we were also looking at the Riverneck Road area, the roads, the streets that are coming off of that are currently zoned IA. And so we'll be coming back to look at those. But I think to a degree, identifying and trying to resolve a number of the zoning conflicts. So I think those both roles we have to play, and they have to keep in mind which one we're doing when we're doing it.
Okay, you want to elaborate on
I
that?
don't know if you can elaborate anymore.
Well, that's why I called on him first. Okay?
You just do it all the time.
No, I think, you know, and I'll just chime in a little bit here. That is probably the most cogent and succinct explanation I think I've heard, okay? Because the distinction between the planning aspect and the regulatory aspect. And this kind of feeds into another question, because you've got that dual role. So some of that necessarily is political, whether you want it or not, it's political. In some communities, the planning board is appointed, and in other communities, the planning board is elected. Do any of you have any thoughts on that situation? What you think is, of course, right now in Chelmsford, obviously you are running for office, so we know that the planning board is elected, and that's what's called for in the charter. But do you have any thoughts on, any opinions on which is better or maybe not? So.
So initially, I guess initially when I was kind of looking at the planning board, I would lean probably more thinking that it would be better as an appointed position. But now that I've been on it 3 years, I actually think we're served well as an elected board. And the reason why I say that is because normally I probably would have never, with someone in my background, finance, I would never think to put my name in to be appointed to the planning board. Because before I got involved, I thought, it had to, someone maybe more with Joel's background was more appropriate.
Engineering.
Based,
right.
Yeah, versus someone with the financial background. Being on an appointed board like the FinCom, we tend to have a lot of finance people, right, or a finance committee.
Two of them sitting right here.
So, we don't have like someone who maybe doesn't have a finance degree or kind of looks at it differently. So I think being an elected board really serves the town well, because it's a 7-person board, and we have different backgrounds, and you balance each other out. And so you're thinking about different aspects when you're thinking about planning and when you're, as Joel mentioned, with the regulatory piece of it.
And it's actually, if I look at the current board and the proposed board, I'd say that it appears that the voters have been able to make those distinctions, okay, in terms of the candidates. Marcie, what do you think?
Not knowing too much about Chelmsford, and the planning boards, the select boards, a lot of people when looking at me would have said, oh, you're a teacher, why wouldn't you go for the school committee? I can tell you anything about schools and education. And it came down to being involved in something and having a project in my neighborhood that sort of said, okay, yeah, let's take a look at what the planning board does. I like the idea of it being an elected position because as a town resident, you get a say in that. So, these people who've had projects come up, can talk to these people and have a say as, hey, I like what you're doing, I want to see you continue to help Chelmsford grow, versus sometimes when you're an appointed board, it almost feels like as a member from the town, you don't have a say in who's representing you in these meetings when these projects come up.
Joel?
Yeah. I was going to say, first of all, and that's one of the great things I think about Marcie running for this position, and I said when they were considering who to appoint to the position, was that it's nice to get new people, fresh blood onto the board, especially somebody who's gone through the experience of being a resident going before a board, which is a very frightening experience.
Yes.
And it's very intimidating. You don't know, and I think a lot of the people who come before the board, they're usually coming because of some crisis, and they feel very vulnerable. They feel powerless. And now all of a sudden, this group of people that you're looking at has power over what happens in your life. Mm-hmm. It's very traumatizing. And for that reason, I think it's really good to keep in new, people who have had that experience so that we all remember, that we have to prioritize understanding that residents, they don't really know zoning, but that they need to be heard and they need to be listened to and they need to be considered. But at the end of the day, we still have to, make our decisions based on what the bylaws and the laws say. But we do need to do it in a way that they feel like they can approach and be heard. And that's why I think that it's great that Marcie's running. I was on an appointed board, and now I'm on an elected board. And the difference, I would say, is in the adjudicatory functions, appointment, I think, makes a lot of sense. Just like we, at least in this state, we don't vote for judges, we appoint judges. There are some states that do vote for judges, yes. But we appoint them. But then our more legislative bodies, planning bodies and so forth, we elect. And that's why I think it makes a lot of sense for, even though the planning board has an adjudicatory function, it's primarily in its more legislative function, if you will, that I think the people need to be able to choose. To some degree, when you have an elected position in a local environment, you have the tendency to vote for locals and for people people you've heard of. So it's a little bit harder to get somebody on who maybe has a particularly good skill or knowledge base that you want to access, But by and large, there are still avenues for that to happen. So I did then, and I still now believe that because the ZBA is appointed and the commission is appointed, I think it's important for the planning board to be elected.
Actually, I never thought of that counterpoint, but I think that's a very, very good point that you bring up about the ZBA. And just for the benefit of our listeners, Chelmsford is a charter town, which means we have governing document called the town charter. It's essentially the constitution of the town, if you want to make that analogy. And when the charter was first being developed, the thought was that those boards that were primarily, or at least more than 50%, policy-driven, should be elected, to your point, and those boards that were primarily regulatory should be appointed. So actually, if you look at the boards in Chelmsford, we pretty much followed that philosophy, and it's really just what Joel said. Those are the differences. And I guess watching the planning board over the years, and like Annita, I didn't feel this way at first, because being somebody who spent my entire life in regulations, I was more focused on that aspect. But really, when you see the projects come up and the neighbors get involved, and as you said, the impact on people's lives, especially in the neighborhood, I guess I feel that the planning aspect maybe is more important if you had to make that divide. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's tough on the planning board. It's like you said, it's easy on the ZBA. Unless you have to do a 40B, and that thinking goes right out the window.
Yeah.
But I mean other things, yeah. So I think very, very, very well said. Very well said. So let me just take a minute here and ask you about what is currently before the planning board and what you may see in the short-term future. I mean, what do you think right now are the most pressing issues that you guys are dealing with? So I'll start with Joel.
Yeah.
We'll make it easy.
I mean, obviously the reduction of the zoning conflicts, which is why we're tackling Kate's Corner, which turned out to be a little bit more complicated than we originally planned.
So for the viewers, just situate Kate's Corner.
Kate's Corner is on Route 27 down near Hart Pond.
Okay.
There's a nice little shop there on the corner. There's a church there as well. Lockheed is actually fairly innocuously, you wouldn't have guessed that was an industrial use, technically. It's got a strange mix of commercial and industrial right next to residential. Mm-hmm. And it was identified in our work with Northern Middlesex Community of Governments, or NIMCOG. It's an organization that's been helping us with zoning things and identified a number of zoning conflicts, and that was one. We thought that would be the easy one to tackle. So I think reduction of that, but I think some of the other things that we need to do too is, for example, we had already decided we wanted to revamp our regulations because we had revamped our policies. Chris LaValle, who is the current vice chair, did that as actually as an associate member. And ironically, the very policies he developed, he couldn't vote on as an associate member.
Right.
But the regulations, there are a number of regulations that these pass for example, Hildreth has brought this to light, our subdivision regulations, and 270 Billerica Road also highlighted with regards to our special permit regulations, that there are certain aspects, particularly with regards to contaminated sites, that the prevalence of PFAS, is 270 is a perfect example where our regulations really, it kind of had a gap. And what we tried to do, and I think we did do, was essentially fill that gap by our actions. But what we need to do is go back and adjust our regulations so that we give ourselves a little more basis for being able to address those kinds of issues. Because in that case, it was a site that you didn't know it had contamination until after the application was already underway. And there are things about uses, but there isn't anything about the actual state of the site. And so that's something that we need to address, but it's complicated because you have the MCP, Massachusetts Contingency Plan, which handles, there is a regulatory process for handling contamination, but that doesn't mean that as a zoning body, we completely give up our interests in aspects of that, which is the interest we took, which was to be concerned about how the stormwater is being applied. And in Hildreth, there was a concern about where we were siting things, houses, yards, with respect to where potentially there was contamination. So these are all issues that, I think we need to dig into a little bit deeper, just to give ourselves a little bit more of a background for when similar applications come before us.
Well, I see the ladies are nodding their heads in agreement, so I'll dovetail on that a little bit because I think that's a very good explanation, and you situated it. As somebody who's lived in town now for 46 years, okay, and I've seen quite a few changes in town, but the thing that struck me early on and continues to baffle me is the nature of our current zoning. By no stretch of the imagination can you say that any of it was planned, okay? And in fact, if you look at the single-family zoned areas, at least half of them are not in compliance with one or more parts of the regulations that specify what has to be for a single-family situation. So, are we ever going to get to a point where you think a lot of that can be addressed and rectified? And I'll ask Annita that question.
Well, the town is an old town, right? You have areas of town that were built, that were, developed more in the 70s, others that were developed in the 50s. I live in East Chelmsford. Our lots are small, right? Extremely small in East Chelmsford. Other areas of town, you have the acre lots. We have industrial areas in different pockets. Kate's Corner is an example. I think we can make it more logical. I think we can tweak certain areas. We will probably always have non-compliance in this town. But I think we can apply a little bit more logic to it. And we're actually working on something that'll be presented as part of Kate's Corner, but potentially a new zoning definition that we could apply to buffer neighborhoods and industrial areas. So you're not, you happen to be right on the line, you don't have this big distribution center.
Would that be the so-called light industrial?
Yeah, light
Okay.
industrial or...
The IA
We haven't decided on naming,
or
but we'll have
IAB.
something. But something that would, again, make it more conducive, more consistent with a town plan, right? With a vision, I guess, of what you want your town to be.
Okay, good. Marcie, any thoughts?
No, I kind of agree with them. Like it is. Chelmsford's got this old town quality to it. And it's one of the things that growing up in Lowell, like, that I liked when you came into town here. It was just different. I had lots of friends from the area. And you would always see something you wouldn't see living in a big city where everything's on top of each other. And even just where I live on Hilder Street, you know, in the process of what's been going on my street, I can figure out which house actually owned most of the street and why we're non-conforming. Half of my street isn't even recognized by the town as a street.
And it's the upper half,
and
not
it's
the
the
lower
upper half.
Yeah.
You would think the lower half, Ryan.
We have a lot of those.
Yeah. And so the top half of the street isn't even recognized as the town because it's non-conforming. And just looking at the lots and how they're developed, you know, a lot of them would also be looked at as non-conforming. So to make something that's been there since the 50s become up to, you know, zoning and conforming is going to be difficult. But I think, you know, as we grow and develop as a town and new things come in, we can really work to have them be conforming to what the zoning bylaws are, what the regulations are. It's very tough to go back and fix what was done years ago, but making sure that things today are meeting the regulations is something that can be done.
Yeah. There's a competing interest to wanting to plan out things the way that sort of makes sense on a map and the way they look. And that is the needs of the moment. And I think you're seeing that, for example, with the article that the town manager is proposing for fast food in the Bayard, the business area overlay district, which is basically 129.
Yes.
And that's a case where it's being driven by, you know, an economic interest, which the town, you know, has an interest in building up its revenue and so forth. And so, you know, having zoning be an element of responsiveness for the town to this sort of economic development is, in some degree, a competing interest to the sort of careful planning that you want to do, because you're trying to be responsive on one hand, and the board has been criticized for not being as responsive as we should be, and we're trying to address that. But on the other hand, you know, we recognize that we do want to cooperate, you know, with what is in the best interest of the town, and sometimes that means being willing to do things like that, as if you ordinarily perhaps wouldn't have done it. And so I think we're always going to have to make that judgment call. So it's not ever going to really look great zoning-wise, but I think we need to be judicious. And in the case of the article, I think it's appropriate that it's the town the town meeting is going to decide that. We're not going to decide that. The town manager is not going to decide that. The town meeting is going to decide that. And I think that's appropriate in the end.
I think so, and I think, you know, to situate that a little bit, as you said, there's always a conflict between how much commercial development is appropriate, especially in a suburban town. You know, you don't get this argument so much in the city areas, okay, but in the suburban towns, and the fact that your whatever your commercial development is, it helps, it mitigates the impact on the residential property taxpayer. So back in the late 90s, we had a value split between commercial and residential. It was as high as 27% on the commercial, and this is in terms of property values, and I'm not counting personal property. This is just real estate and residential. That number now is down to, it's about a 12% commercial on value. So this impacts the residential taxpayer, okay? And it also makes it more difficult. If the select board wants to do a tax shift, it makes it more difficult to do when your commercial values are that low, okay? So what do you guys think, knowing Chelmsford as you do, and you've been here forever, Joel's been here a long time, and you've been here for a long time, do you think it's appropriate if we actually proactively try to increase that value percentage in terms of the commercial presence in town? Any thoughts on that? And I'll just, before I didn't mean to cut you off, but we actually had, 10 years ago, we had a person run for the Board of Selectmen on a platform of we've got to increase the commercial development in town. And a lot of that is what drove the zoning overlay on the 129 corridor. Okay, so that's really what got that started. And if I may say so, I don't think that the expectations have been met in that regard in terms of what's happened in the 129 area. And we can talk about that. I think the economy has played a role in that, and there's all kinds of things. So what do you think about what do you think is appropriate in terms of trying to address the lack of commercial value in town? I'll put it that way. Because we are on the low side, comparatively speaking, with other communities around us.
I'd have to say, like, I've always been shocked on 129 that there's not more sort of like in the areas of like restaurants or, you know, looking at putting in zoning for two.
And that was the
drive-through things.
intention when they did the
Right,
overlay.
because when you
Right.
look at Chelmsford, like most of it's either in Drum Hill, you have a couple right in the center, but nothing, there's not really a lot. So to go to some of the places, you have to go out of town for. And even driving into Westford, you get into, you know, Westford Center there, and there's a bunch of different things. So it's always been a surprise that we can't get some of that stuff in Chelmsford. But it's how do you get it in? And yeah, you know, when COVID hit, some of that stuff just, it fell off. You have places closing, they can't seem to reopen. So now it's going to be how do we do something like that, bring them in, use the overlay so that we can get some things in there, which might allow us to also keep some businesses, because if their, you know, employees have no place to sort of like, hey, we're taking a client out for lunch, but we got to go 3 towns over, are they going to want to stay in town? Or if we give them something like that, it encourages these businesses to stay around.
But in fairness, our vacancy rate has gone down. I mean, before COVID, we were 18%, and now we're
We had
down
almost
to,
we had almost 1 million square feet of vacant commercial,
And now we're down to,
existing development,
I
right?
think, under 5 or 5%, which
Yeah.
is pretty normal for communities, right, from a vacancy rate. You know, do we have those big, you know, like, we're not a Burlington, obviously, and we're not even a Billerica, right? Like, that's close to it. And believe it or not, the biggest taxpayers are 2 developments in town. They're not even commercial, right? They're the housing, one off of Turnpike, and I forget the other one, but they're these, you know,
Kensington.
yeah, they're, you know, these huge apartment buildings. They're actually the biggest
Yes, they
taxpayers. They're
are.
not even, it's not even a, you know, these commercial sites that you would think are driving our, you know, are contributing to our tax revenue. And I agree with Marcie. It is surprising, but I think, you know, when we did this overlay, the timing wasn't great. Right before COVID, and that, you know, kind of took a step back.
Yeah. One of the things that we're doing is that we've already identified that we want to have some better information on what the market is and what particularly makes sense for us in terms of improving, you know, commercial interest within Chelmsford. And so there's a grant that we're going to be applying to see if we can get funding for a study or at least support in that, as well as invite
That's good
you
to
know,
hear.
experts in to hear from them. But it's something that we do want to take up and look at fairly carefully, because I think we recognize that the attempts so far haven't really produced what we want. And so we want to look at it a little more carefully to make sure that what we're crafting makes sense with not only the way the situation is now, but where they expect the situations to be going. You know, I mean, there's still risk in everything, but at least
Exactly.
give us some idea. You know?
And based on your answers, you know, we can assume that all 3 of you figure that really is an appropriate thing for the planning board to do, is to drive some of that.
Yeah.
And I think that's important. And just from my perspective, having been here forever, not as long as you, close, but we're sort of limited in terms of land, because the build-out really from 1960 to 1970 was residential. That was really the build-out, you know. So it's tough, I think, to address. But it's good to hear that you folks feel that we need to keep that at the forefront, and because we hear that all the time from the residents. There goes our property tax bill.
Yeah, that's actually one of the interesting thing about Kate's Corner is that where we're looking at a sort of transition zone that would have sort of elements of commercial and very light industrial, meaning like office R&D kinds of things, together very light manufacturing in the same zone, so that you can leverage some of these in-between areas potentially. And so it's going to be interesting to see what comes out of that, because we're considering whether this could be a pattern for us to use elsewhere in town as well.
So this is a template, you think, or could be a template?
We will see.
Yeah.
We will see.
Well, that's a good way of looking at it, and I have watched your meetings in terms of the Kate's Corner thing. And I have to say, I think the engagement has been pretty good with the neighborhood, and the neighbors have been pretty reasonable, in the way they've approached the board. It doesn't always go that way. You'd know something about that, wouldn't you?
No, I wouldn't.
Yeah, okay. I swear, I like I say, I've been here forever, and I've had some exposure to this process, being on the Board of Assessors. And I tell people, if this were now, my house could not get permitted where I am on River Meadow, because I'm on a swamp. That was swamp area. And back before we had sewerage, we had nothing but trouble because there's no drainage. Yeah. And today it would not be permitted today. And I had those same thoughts about Hildreth too. I wonder how that all happened, So
Well, the issue with Hildreth is that it's RC. That's really the
well, yes, that too. Well, that whole area. I mean, that whole area.
My neighborhood is RC.
Yes, we're all RC. So the ADU thing didn't affect us at all, did it? No.
There actually was a house
Yeah.
that sold within the past couple of years on Golden Cove at the end of Dawn, I believe. And they tried to sell it as a multifamily, et cetera, or two different houses on the same lot or whatever. Couple that bought it, they were coming from Cambridge, and they said, I don't want that. I want one house.
Right, there you go.
And so that, to some degree, there is sort of that feeling within the neighborhood. I think that's why it stayed largely single family as opposed to duplex.
It's interesting when you look at that. When you look at the difference between the single family and the two family zoning, the RB and the RC in our codes. From a market standpoint, single family house in an RC zone actually, from a retail marketing aspect, actually makes it more valuable, but from an assessment standpoint, no. Okay, so I mean, that's just a conflict that we have. So it's very interesting. And I look at that whole RC situation from the center of town, down Bill Ricker, on the right side, down Turnpike, the area where I am in the center, it's all, and where you are on Golden Cove, it's all RC. And you say, why?
Well, actually, oddly
Why did
enough,
they do this?
the western side of Golden Cove is RB.
Yes,
The eastern side is RC.
there you go, yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense, but
No,
more of that zoning,
no, it doesn't.
zoning strangeness of Chelmsford.
So I briefly mentioned ADUs, which is an acronym for accessory dwelling units. So we had a big controversy over that recently. We also had a big controversy over the so-called MBTA zoning. And these are things that, well, certainly in the MBTA situation, the planning board really took an active role. So let's talk a little bit about that and how you guys approached it, and what you see generally going forward from a state mandated situation. How should we respond? How do we respond adequately to those situations where the state decides that they're going to take control of our local zoning, partially? And that's how I would characterize MBTA.
Yeah, I want to say on MBTA that everyone should go back and look at the original tapings of the hearings, because it was Annita who said, sort of right from the beginning, is like, hey guys, let's do this way. Let's do it in a way where we're satisfying the law, but we're not really, the likelihood of it happening is not great. And that's pretty much what the board followed through to the end.
And it looks like a few other towns have adopted that same approach too, from what I can see, as opposed to, stamping your feet and pounding the table and say, we're going to sue or we're going to wait. And personally, I don't think that's the right approach.
Yeah.
I would never, as a town official, I would never recommend that we don't obey the law, but that's just me, okay? And I would assume any competent legal counsel would give you that advice.
Well, that's exactly it, right? It's a state mandate, so we do have to obey the law.
Right.
We may not like it, and I think a lot of people on the board don't particularly like the state mandating these things. We like to have control. That's why we're on the planning board. We like to have control of how our town develops. I do recognize that there is a housing shortage in the state. However, I'm not sure I agree with those at the State House on how they plan on fixing it. Their fixes are, I don't think are addressing the real problem. They're addressing a symptom of the problem, that there's a housing crunch, in the Metro Boston area along 128. They're not focusing on, because there's plenty of land out west in Worcester. Worcester lost a lot of manufacturing jobs. And we need to push companies out there because there's plenty of land out there for housing, for
Cheap
people.
land.
Cheap land. We've got Lowell, we used to be, back in the 80s, a big computer hub. Now that's gone away, right? Like, you can only, fine, we can put more houses, in Chelmsford, in Lowell, in Westford. But if our jobs are in Boston and it takes us 3 hours to get there, like, what kind of quality of life is that? So, fundamentally, I do think, we have to follow the state mandates because that's the law. I'm certainly not a fan of, I just think sometimes the state mandates may not be what I agree with, but we can do them smartly when
As best we can.
best we can.
I remember sitting in, like, when my neighbor was going through it, they were talking about the MBTA zoning laws and, looking at the different sites and how do we make this so that we meet the required number of units we need to have within the constraints from the, what the town can actually support and do and what, the state's requiring us to do. And it was a very well thought out process as they were going through and looking at the different sites and, taking a look, well, how can we do this? How can we do this? So that we make sure that we're meeting the needs of the states. And even with the ADUs, we might not all agree on what the planning board has come up with. But the planning board really took a look at what the state's saying, what as a town can we really support? Because there is, we, have the problem with the, we don't have sewer capacity, it says, oh, we can't look at parking. Well, where are these people going to park if they don't have spaces on the property that they're at? There isn't spaces, it's not, well, we don't have a parking garage that people can, park their garage and come and walk to their homes. So you do have to look at some of those factors in as you put some of these things in. And I think some of that stuff is, the state's not looking at that because they see Boston and this is how it is. Everyone has a parking spot at a local garage, or you're always taking a bus or the train or the subway. That's not necessarily here because I'm not going to Boston, and where I'm working, I can't actually take a train to, or I can't catch the bus. It doesn't go by that way. So we do rely on some of these things. So we have to look at, well, how do we make what the state's saying match what our town can support?
Yeah. You'd never guess she was on the board for only 2 months.
This is why we're having this conversation. It's important for the voters to know who they're voting for or potentially voting for. That whole MBTA zoning thing was done, in my opinion, superbly. It was handled superbly by.
And kudos to
by
Chris
the board.
LaValle.
Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. He gets, and you get credit. You all get credit for that. But the one thing that I thought was, well, more than one thing, but one thing I thought that was very interesting in that whole process, and it again, and I'm going to get into the question, it's the perception that people have in town as to what's going on versus the reality and what you guys are trying to do. Because let's face it, this is the United States of America, and most Americans have been brought up to distrust their government, whether it's local, state, federal. I think it gets worse as each succeeding level gets bigger. But I mean, we're Americans. This is what we do.
Yeah.
So we tend not to believe what we're being told by our elected officials and so on and so forth. And a lot of
I don't think it's just that. I think really it's largely that residents are not aware of zoning per se. The zoning that 99% of the zoning to them is what they see, right? So it's like what I'm used to seeing, and now I'm living in a condominium or whatever, and you're telling me that now I'm going to be subject to a high degree whatever, I could lose my home, that sort of thing. So
Well,
these are the fears that come about.
that was the argument. People were concerned about the value of their property
Right.
if you did a zoning overlay.
Right.
Had nothing to do with whether or not anything was actually going to be torn down and rebuilt, which the likelihood is somewhere between 0 and -2, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
which is why the
But,
strategy was brilliant.
But it's understandable that people
Yeah.
would be upset.
Oh, of
And-
course,
And,
of
and
course.
also understandable that they're just not aware of what's
course.
going on.
Yeah.
And so, so I think that Deirdre, the chair,
Mm-hmm.
and Chris and others managed the process very well,
They
which
did.
is to let people come in, let them speak, listen to them,
Mm-hmm.
interact with them. Chris did a lot of work, going and just actually talking to individuals and
Mm-hmm.
so forth and so on, so that we can bring people on board. And I think that's the right way to do it, in the sense of acknowledge that people are going to be upset, but also give them an opportunity to talk,
Mm-hmm.
and then show that you're listening and caring about what they say. And I felt really bad because one guy, when he was talking, I don't remember what I was doing, but it probably was because Paul was making some comment or something next to me. And so I kind of laughed, and he said, "Oh, you can laugh about this, but whatever." And so we went on break, and I went straight to him afterwards in the hall, and I said, I'm sorry that it looked like I was laughing, and I was not laughing, and I take these things, take what you're having to say seriously. But I think that's what we really want to try to communicate to the citizens, is that we don't expect you to know what's going on, but do listen to what we have to say, and we will listen to you, and then see if we can't work something out that satisfies both the requirements of what we have to do, but also to, as much as possible, takes into consideration, your feelings or your thoughts about this.
Well, and I think that's exactly right. And the ideal is that you want to project that you're on their side, okay, as much as you can be legally.
Well, at least that we take what they say with a. There's always, it's not a level playing field, because an applicant
No, it's not.
always has, one, they're knowledgeable of what they're doing. They will have a representative, a lawyer or an engineer, who's very familiar with doing these things, knows people by name, on the board. And then you have a resident coming in, they know nothing. They're not known, they don't know anything that's going, they scramble to get up to speed.
Yep.
First time they've ever been before a
First
board
time
and
they've ever been,
spoken in public.
You
Yep,
had to speak in
exactly.
public.
And that neighborhood did a great job, as did the people on North Road. You see, that's the thing I'm most impressed by, is that people become knowledgeable very quickly, But the important thing is to say, I'm going to hear what you have to say. And the thing that I think is a real sort of question is, how much do we interact versus how much do we take what they say and try to communicate that we've heard? Because you don't necessarily want to go into a back and forth. You don't necessarily want to correct somebody, not necessarily, because you want to sound like you're listening to what they say. But you do want to know that you have you have citizens and you have an applicant. They all have rights. Everyone has rights.
Exactly.
And we have to acknowledge those and keep those into account. But we don't do what residents want. We don't do what the applicant wants. We do what the town has expressed to us, are the guidelines by which we make our decisions, which are the bylaws. We're a nation of laws, and this board follows the law. And we will not listen to somebody. We will listen to them. And I think also, even though it's not legally required according to open meeting law, we should let them speak. And I think that's a very, very important thing that I think Deirdre, the chair, has done very well, has to let people speak.
You mean
Even-
outside of a public hearing?
No, I mean in a public hearing.
Okay.
When you come up to the podium, you do try to control the time, and the chair has every right to not let anybody speak.
That is
I mean,
correct.
they have the legal right to do that. So it's at the chair's discretion, and the chair has done a very good job letting people talk, and even letting them go on sometimes. We had one meeting that went on until like 11 o'clock at night, but I was,
Well,
even
yes.
though I was tired, I was glad, because that's what we as a board need to communicate, is we realize we're making decisions that will impact your life in a significant way. And so we will give you the opportunity to let us know how you feel, and we're going to listen to you. And then we're going to try to communicate as best we can where we are, so that you can kind of get a sense of what's this board thinking, what's this board doing.
And not to say, as a citizen coming up to that podium and having to speak my thoughts, my opinions, and do all that research on very short notice, sometimes within 3 days. One of the things that I actually liked about actually speaking in front of the planning board was that, yeah, I can ask them a question. They're not necessarily going to give me an answer, but I could give them my thoughts, my opinions, my concerns. And there were many times where members of the planning boards would ask me additional questions so that they would have all of the facts. And I think you have to get the facts from the residents because they're the ones who live there. They're the ones who see what's happening. They know what's going on a day-to-day basis. And in just in asking us some of the questions on Hilda Street, it's like, well, we're going to change how we would normally do a traffic study. We're going to do it not just traffic, but safety because it is a non-conforming street. There is differences. There is a school at the end of the street that our kids don't get bused to the center school
I
because
can't think of a better example in town of a non-conforming situation than that entire area.
Yes,
It's unbelievable.
I
Right.
think that's why we bought there because it was it was going to be difficult.
Are these streets or are they sidewalks?
Right, you know.
That's the first thing I see when I see that area.
Yes, but you know, it's
Right.
got that old town feel to it, and it's changing some of it's going to change a lot of it, and we have had change over the last few years there. But being able to go in front of the board and say, hey, this is what I would like to share with you. I've had some great questions asked of me that I said brought. Okay, well, wait a minute. Now that we hear this too, how does this change this? So it gives the board some more to think about, and you can see the whole picture. You don't just see, hey, I'm the person about the property, I'm the engineer, this is what we want to do. I don't live there, but we do. What are you seeing? What's going on?
There's a funny story about that too, because her dad, who I'm sorry to say passed this last fall.
Yes, sorry about
But
that.
Thank you.
But her dad was up at the podium and he was really pressing us with questions. Like, what are you going to do about this? What are you going to do about that? And then the board was silent. There was this quiet in the room, and I think it was your mom.
No.
Said, was it you? Said, "That's enough, Bob." And he just stood straight up.
That's it.
He did an about face and he marched away from the podium. I thought, wow.
That's about right. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Because, well, that was my dad. Like, he was very concerned about the neighborhood. And, he was one, I want the answers now. And that's how he's always been. I want the answers now. And it's when he came back and said, I'm like, you do know they're not going to give you the answers today. They're listening to you. They're going to put their thoughts in. And we're going to hear about some of these questions that you asked next week. Or when they go and start talking amongst themselves, some of the things that you brought up are going to be mentioned. You've put that thought in their head. You planted the seed so that they can say, oh, hey, wait a minute. Why wouldn't we know about this? Or why isn't this brought to our attention? How is this going to affect this? So, yeah, as a citizen, you have that ability to come and speak at the planning board meetings so that we as members of the planning board can see things differently and be like, hey, wait a minute. This wasn't put in here, but now I got to think about it. Is this going to be the best plan to meet what they want? They've come to us with and fit the neighborhoods and our zonings.
Yeah, I think your dad would be very proud of you.
I'm
know
sure.
that you're
I'm
right.
sure he would. More dialogue is better than restricted dialogue. That's for sure. So I'm going to ask Anita, because you kind of were the driving force on this one. ADUs.
ADU is my favorite.
That's why I'm asking you. So
Yep.
you can start that off. And we have about 6 minutes, so
He's about 60.
yeah.
Yeah. Again, the state's attempt to fix this housing shortage, they rolled out this very large bill, which had a small little piece of it about ADUs, accessory dwelling units, and their reasoning behind it was, generational living. Someone can put a 900 square foot.
So we're talking about just for the viewers, we're talking about single family zoned plots.
Yep.
And what the ADU law purported to do, and now does because it's been passed, is that it gives the owner of a single family lot the right, by right so-called, to construct an accessory dwelling unit where prior to that, that was either not allowed or could only be allowed by review of the planning board, okay? So continue.
In essence, it
Yeah.
pretty much wiped out single-family zoning in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
And Cambridge has actually formalized that. You're
Yep.
aware of that? They changed their zoning bylaws. There is no more single-family zoning
Yep.
in Cambridge. So anybody who thought that wasn't going to happen, I point them to Cambridge. Okay?
Exactly. And
Right.
so, again, this was a mandate. We had to comply. One of our issues, and you yourself spoke at the State House about this, was that the state didn't require owner-occupied. So their reasoning for this ADU bylaw was because they wanted generational living. However, they failed to put owner-occupied. So now that what this does is it encourages developers to come in and plop a single family, an accessory dwelling unit, and now it becomes a rental income. And as you know, developers have deeper pockets than individuals and young couples who are trying to start out in life. And my concern on this at the time was that they're going to continue to outbid, like we're not helping the housing shortage. So we had to comply, and it was very, there wasn't a lot of leeway for us to put some restrictions in. We did our best. We did, they do have to comply to dimensional requirements, and where we could, we tried to restrict it as much as possible to maintain that town feel. Like, for example, you can't put an accessory dwelling, you can't put one of these 900 square foot homes in the front yard, right? It has to.
Which if we had just accepted the state law as written, that would be a possibility.
Right.
Yeah.
So we want to, we did do what we could to make sure that it didn't negatively impact the town and the community feel as much as we could. But this was difficult because I think the state smartened up after the MBTA when they rolled out the MBTA. And there wasn't a lot we could do, but we did do what we could.
And the town meeting accepted that.
Accepted it,
And
yeah.
so now we have to wait to see what the Attorney General has to say as to whether or not they'll accept the article as it was proposed. So do you have any thoughts on that? What do you think they're going to do, Joel?
I think they'll accept it.
I thought the changes from the regulatory standpoint versus what they were trying to accomplish, as Anita says overall, are minor. That's the way I looked at it.
Yeah.
Yep.
I can't see the AG overruling
Yeah.
any part of that.
With
but-
town council review, we specifically
Yeah.
were looking at what was going to get us on hot water, so we didn't. We stayed as close to the line as we could.
Yeah, again, like the MBTA zoning, I think you guys handled that very well. Very quickly, we got about 2 minutes. The way you guys engage developers, are you happy with that? Would you like to see some changes? And the reason I ask that is because historically I've seen projects drag out for a year, 2 years, and then ultimately they're denied, okay? So I think you understand where I'm going with this. Very quickly, you got about 2 minutes. Any thoughts on that?
I think we've changed how we're engaging developers. I think we've given them more feedback as they're presenting projects, which I think, helps with the process. I think we can certainly do better. There's always areas of improvement as we look at, how we engage, what our requirements are. We can certainly improve, but I do think the long 2-year projects, I'm hoping that those are behind us. And I think, once, we had a significant board change over the last 3 years. And so I think the new developers, their representatives, whether the engineers or the attorneys, now kind of know what we're looking for as a board.
Okay, good.
I'll
Quickly?
point to Hildreth. What we denied it on, we raised as an issue in the first hearing. So preparation and signaling to the applicant as much as possible what your issues are
That's a good
and
example.
what need to be addressed is important. I think sometimes that straw polls might be helpful. The board isn't always inclined to do that because they're always trying to balance we need to be able to hear the full story, as opposed to,
Right.
this is my opinion right out of the gate. But I think you can certainly identify issues that need to be addressed, and if they don't get addressed, then they become potentials for serious problems for the application.
Yep, good. And I have seen a shift, as both you and Anita have identified. You're a little bit more attuned to the fact that, gee, if there's a strong potential, if we're going to say no, maybe we shouldn't drag it out for 2 years. And like you said, some of the signaling that occurred at the beginning. So, well, we're just about out of time, and I want to thank all three of you for coming in, and I think we've had a very good discussion. Hopefully the voters will engage. We'll be up on YouTube tonight. Telemedia does that very quickly. So good luck to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us, Sam.
And
Yep.
that is a wrap. Now, see, that wasn't too bad.